Imagine stepping into a cockpit where the real turbulence isn't in the sky. It's in the system designed to see you fail. Meet Marcus Reynolds, a pilot who doesn't just fight gravity, he fights the politics, the prejudice, and the silent war waged against him at 35,000 feet. But when the game is rigged, how do you play to win? Stay tuned, because this is a flight you don't want to miss. The morning sun stretched over the Atlanta skyline, casting golden streaks across the rooftops. Marcus Reynolds sat in his small, tidy apartment, staring at the email on his laptop screen. His fingers hovered over the trackpad, hesitating. The subject line was simple: interview invitation, Skyward Aviation. He exhaled slowly. It wasn't just another interview. This was the interview. His chance to finally step into the world of commercial aviation, something he had worked towards since he was a kid watching planes slice through the sky above Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. But deep down, he knew what this meant. Skyward Aviation wasn't just any airline. It was prestigious, selective, and, if he was being honest, exclusive in a way that had nothing to do with skill. He had heard the stories. People like him didn't make it far in places like that. He could already picture the interviewers, older, skeptical, and ready to find a reason. Any reason to turn him down. His phone buzzed on the counter, shaking him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. "Mom," he sighed before answering. "Hey, Ma. Did you check your email yet?" Her voice was light, hopeful. "Yeah," he said, rubbing his forehead. "I got it." Her pause was brief, but he heard the hesitation. "That's great, baby. I know you've been waiting for this." "I have." "Then why do you sound like you're about to carry a boulder up a mountain?" He chuckled. She knew him too well. "Because I know how this is going to go. They'll see my resume, act impressed, then they'll see me, and suddenly they'll have concerns." "Marcus." "I know, Ma," he said before she could go into one of her speeches. "I'm still going. I don't want to get my hopes up, that's all." She didn't argue. She never did when he felt like this. Instead, she sighed the way only mothers could when their child was about to face something unfair. "Just be you," she finally said. "That's all you need to do." Marcus wished that were true. By the time he hung up, the doubt still clung to him like the humidity outside. He forced himself to get up, stretch, and push past it. He had worked too hard to let hesitation win now. Tomorrow he would walk into that interview. He would sit across from whoever Skyward thought was worthy enough to judge him. And if they were planning to doubt him the second he walked through the door, then he'd give them something to remember. Marcus stood outside the towering Skyward Aviation headquarters, adjusting his tie with steady fingers. The building's glass facade reflected the crisp morning sky, but the air around him felt heavier than it should. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. It was just an interview. He had done dozens before. But this one was different. Inside, the receptionist barely looked up before directing him to the 24th floor. The elevator ride was silent except for the occasional ding as the numbers climbed. He watched the reflection of his own face in the polished doors. Calm, composed, unreadable. The interview room was sleek, professional, and colder than it needed to be. 3 men and 1 woman sat behind a long conference table. Their expressions were neutral, but Marcus knew neutrality when he saw it, the kind that hid judgment beneath politeness. "Marcus Reynolds," the man at the center said, flipping through his file. "Impressive resume. Graduated top of your class. Trained under Captain Whitmore. That's no small feat." "Thank you," Marcus replied evenly. The man glanced up, smiling just enough to seem cordial. "I'm Richard Coleman, head of pilot recruitment. This is Captain Wilkes from our senior training department and Mr. Patel from aviation operations." The woman barely nodded when Richard gestured toward her. "And this is Ms. Dorsey from HR." Marcus gave a polite nod in return, but something in Richard's tone felt off. The way he looked at Marcus, calculating, assessing, like he was already looking for a reason to dismiss him. The first few questions were expected. His training, his flight hours, situational responses to in-flight problems. He answered them smoothly, confidently. Then Richard leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. "I have to ask, Marcus, do you feel prepared to take on the responsibility of flying for a company of this caliber?" Marcus held his gaze. Absolutely. Richard hummed. You're young. Limited commercial experience. Do you think passengers will feel comfortable knowing someone with your background is in the cockpit? Marcus stiffened. He knew exactly what Richard meant by background, even if he didn't say it outright. My background is top-tier aviation training and a flawless record, Marcus said coolly. I trust passengers would feel comfortable knowing their pilot is someone who's worked hard to be here. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course, but airlines like Skyward, well, we have a certain standard. Silence settled over the room, thick and telling. Captain Wilkes finally spoke, flipping through Marcus's file. You're aware that Skyward's flight teams operate at the highest level. No room for error, no room for miscalculations. Marcus let that sink in. He wasn't unfamiliar with conversations like these. He knew how to read between the lines. No room for people like you. He leaned forward slightly, making sure his voice was steady. That's why I applied here, because I meet that standard. Richard gave a small chuckle, like he found something amusing. Confidence is good, Marcus. Let's move on. The rest of the interview felt more like an interrogation than an assessment. The questions weren't about his skills anymore. They were about testing him, trying to push him into making a mistake. He knew what was happening. By the time it ended, Richard was still smiling. Thank you for coming in. We'll be in touch. Marcus shook their hands, his own grip firm, controlled. He knew what "we'll be in touch" meant. He was already halfway to the elevator when he heard a voice behind him. Reynolds, hold on. He turned to see Ms. Dorsey, the HR woman who had barely spoken, standing a few steps behind him. You should know, she said quietly. They had already made their decision before you walked in. Marcus's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice even. And what decision was that? Ms. Dorsey hesitated. Then in a low voice she said, It wasn't a fair interview, and it was never meant to be. Marcus let that sit for a second. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. When he stepped into the elevator, his hands curled into fists. He had walked in expecting this, but hearing it confirmed left something heavy in his chest. If Skyward Aviation thought they could write him off that easily, they were in for a surprise. Marcus stepped out of Skyward Aviation's glass tower, his footsteps measured, his breathing even. But inside, his mind churned. The city's usual hum, honking horns, distant chatter, the low rumble of planes overhead, felt muted against the echo of Miss Dorsey's words. It wasn't a fair interview, and it was never meant to be. He had known. Of course, he had known. But knowing and hearing it confirmed were two different things. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing his mom's name again. He hesitated, then let it go to voicemail. He wasn't ready to tell her. Not yet. The train ride home was quiet. His reflection in the window looked composed, but he felt the familiar tension in his shoulders, the same weight he carried every time he was judged before he even had a chance to prove himself. He was about to step into his apartment when another buzz shook his phone. This time, it wasn't his mother. It was a number he didn't recognize. He swiped to answer. Marcus Reynolds. A deep, steady voice filled his ear. Mr. Reynolds, this is David Holloway, the CEO's assistant at Skyward Aviation. Are you available to speak? Marcus stopped mid-step. Yeah, sure. A pause, then. We'd like you to come back in tomorrow morning. The CEO, James Reynolds, would like to meet with you personally. Marcus's stomach twisted. Not because of the James Reynolds, one of the most powerful figures in aviation, but because of what came next. Your father insisted on it. The words struck like a sudden wind shift in midair. Marcus gripped the phone tighter. I see, he said, his voice carefully neutral. What time? 9 a.m. sharp. We'll see you then. The call ended. Marcus let his hand drop, the phone still clutched in his fingers. So this was it. He had walked into that interview as Marcus Reynolds, pilot. They had dismissed him. Now they knew he was Marcus Reynolds, son of James Reynolds. And suddenly everything had changed. His jaw clenched. If they thought he was just going to take a handout, they didn't know him at all. Marcus sat in his car outside Skyward Aviation's headquarters, gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. The city was just waking up, but his mind had been racing long before sunrise. The last time he had walked through those glass doors, he had been just another pilot, Another hopeful applicant trying to prove he was good enough? Now, he was something else entirely. His father had stepped in. He didn't know what was worse, the fact that they had dismissed him before he even had a chance, or the fact that now they were suddenly eager to talk, not because of his skills, but because of his last name. He exhaled through his nose. If Skyward thought they could control this, they were wrong. Straightening his tie, he stepped out of the car and walked through the main entrance. This time, the receptionist looked up. "Mr. Reynolds?" she said, her voice suddenly more polite. "You can go straight up. Mr. Holloway's waiting for you." The change in tone wasn't lost on him. A name could shift the entire atmosphere of a room. The elevator ride felt different today. No anxious anticipation, no wondering if they'd take him seriously. Now he was a known factor, but not for the right reasons. When he stepped into the executive wing, a sharply dressed man in his 50s, David Holloway, greeted him with a tight smile. "Mr. Reynolds, right this way." Marcus followed, his footsteps steady, controlled. They entered a sleek office, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the city. And there, behind a polished mahogany desk, sat James Reynolds, his father, the man who had shaped Skyward Aviation into what it was, the man who had always seemed larger than life, and the man Marcus had spent his entire career trying to not rely on. James stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached. "Marcus," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. Marcus met his gaze evenly. "Dad." There was no warmth, no fatherly embrace. Just two men sizing each other up. James motioned to a seat across from him. "Sit." Marcus did. Holloway stayed by the door, silent but observant. James steepled his fingers. "So, I heard about your interview." Marcus kept his expression unreadable. "Did you?" James studied him for a moment. "They should have hired you on the spot." Marcus let out a dry chuckle. "Funny, that's not the impression I got." His father exhaled, leaning back. "I won't lie to you, Marcus. This company, this industry, has its ways, and sometimes those ways are outdated." Marcus tilted his head. "Outdated? That's an interesting way to describe outright bias." James didn't flinch. "I won't argue with you on that, but the fact is, I made a call, and now you have another chance." Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady. "A chance at what? A job I didn't actually earn? A position that suddenly became available the second they realized who I was?" His father sighed, rubbing his temple. "Marcus, you earned that spot before you ever walked in. I'm just making sure they see it." Marcus shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Number, you're making sure they don't ignore me. There's a difference." A long silence stretched between them. Then James said, "Take the job, and once you're in, change it from the inside." Marcus blinked. He hadn't expected that. James leaned forward. "You think I built Skyward without knowing how this game works? Change doesn't happen from the outside, son. It happens when people like you get inside and refuse to play by the old rules." Marcus studied his father, searching for any sign of manipulation. But for once, the man in front of him wasn't trying to control him. He was offering him something, an opportunity to fight. Marcus exhaled, glancing out the window. The skyline stretched out before him, endless. He turned back. "I'll take the job." His father nodded. "Good. But on one condition," Marcus added, meeting his father's gaze. "I want to go through the same process as every other hire. No favors, no shortcuts, no special treatment." James considered him for a long moment. Then he gave a slow, approving nod. "Then prove them wrong," he said. Marcus intended to. Marcus stood in the Skyward Aviation training facility, surrounded by the hum of engines being tested, flight simulators running drills, and the faint scent of jet fuel lingering in the air. This was where pilots were made or broken. He had been here before, years ago as a kid, watching his father walk through these halls, shaking hands with senior pilots and executives. Back then, it had all seemed untouchable. Now he was here on his own terms. Almost. Richard Coleman stood in front of him, arms crossed, a tight smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. The same man who had dismissed him in the interview now had to oversee his evaluation. Welcome back, Reynolds, Richard said, voice smooth, but laced with something Marcus didn't trust. We've arranged a final assessment before officially clearing you to join the pilot roster. Marcus gave a slow nod. Good, I'd expect nothing less. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. That's the right attitude. But I should warn you, this won't be a standard check ride. We need to be absolutely certain that you can handle the pressure of flying for Skyward. We hold our pilots to the highest standards. Marcus didn't miss the way he emphasized we. Behind Richard, two senior captains stood near a simulator setup, a full-motion rig designed to mimic the exact cockpit of a Skyward Boeing 787. One of them, Captain Wilkes from the interview panel, was reviewing a clipboard. The other, Captain Davis, was someone Marcus didn't recognize, but his expression was unreadable. Let's get started, Richard said, leading the way to the simulator. Marcus followed, his movements steady, controlled. He had trained for this. He had spent years mastering these exact conditions. If they were hoping he'd crack under pressure, they were going to be disappointed. Inside the simulator, the controls and displays flickered to life. Everything about it was designed to feel real: the seats, the instrument panels, even the slight hum of the simulated engines. Richard stood behind him, arms still crossed. Scenario's simple, he said. You're the captain of Skyward Flight 209. Mid-flight, you experience an unexpected systems failure. Your job? Get that plane and your passengers to safety. You'll have one of our trainers acting as your first officer. Sound good? Marcus nodded. Sounds good. Excellent, Richard said, his smirk widening. We'll be throwing in a few surprises, of course. Marcus didn't react. He knew exactly what that meant. The simulator kicked into gear, and just like that, he was airborne. The simulated sun cast a golden glow over the horizon, the hum of the engines filling the cockpit. The first officer, a quiet but competent-looking man named Jacobs, gave him a nod. Flight 209, cruising at 36,000 feet, Jacobs said, reading off the instruments. Everything looks stable. Marcus adjusted the controls, his hand steady. Let's keep it that way. But he knew better. It wouldn't last. 30 minutes in, the first surprise hit. An electrical failure. The autopilot flickered, then cut out entirely. Marcus reacted instantly, switching to manual controls. We've lost autopilot, he said calmly, reverting to manual. Jacobs nodded, adjusting his own instruments. No warnings on hydraulics, just an electrical issue. Marcus kept the plane steady. If this was all they had, it wasn't much of a test. Then the second failure hit. One engine shut down. Marcus barely blinked. Engine 1 failure, initiating emergency protocol. Jacobs worked alongside him, following standard procedure. Marcus adjusted the thrust, compensated for the imbalance, and kept them on course. Then the third failure hit. The second engine died. A twin-engine failure at cruising altitude. Marcus's grip on the controls tightened. Now that was serious. He could feel Richard watching from behind the glass, waiting for him to panic, waiting for him to mess up. He wouldn't. Initiating emergency descent, Marcus said, adjusting the angle of the aircraft. Restart procedure for both engines. Let's buy ourselves some altitude. Jacobs worked the checklist, but the restart failed. They were gliding now, no propulsion, nothing but gravity and Marcus's skill keeping them from becoming a disaster. Nearest airport? Marcus asked, his voice level. 70 miles, Jacobs said. Not an option. Marcus exhaled. Then we find another. He scanned the terrain, the virtual world outside the windshield showing rolling hills and sparse open fields. There, a stretch of flat land, long enough. We're going down there, Marcus said. Jacobs hesitated. That's not in the database. We don't have time for databases. We're landing this plane now. The cockpit filled with alarms, warning chimes overlapping, demanding his attention. Marcus ignored them. He adjusted the flaps, preparing for an emergency landing. The field rushed up to meet them. The wheels touched down rough, too fast but controlled. The simulator shuddered around them as the plane jolted, slowing, until finally it came to a stop. Silence. Then the overhead speakers clicked on. Simulation complete. The cockpit door opened, and Richard stepped in, arms crossed. His smirk was gone. Not bad, he said, but his tone made it clear. He wasn't happy. Marcus unbuckled, standing slowly. "Let me guess," he said. "Not perfect enough?" Richard exhaled through his nose. "You landed a commercial jet on an unverified field. That's, unorthodox." Marcus shrugged. "So is losing both engines at cruising altitude. You wanted to see if I could land the plane?" "I landed the plane." Richard stared at him, jaw tightening. Captain Wilkes and Captain Davis exchanged glances. Finally, Captain Davis spoke. "I've seen worse landings from 10-year veterans," he said. Wilkes nodded, reluctant but approving. "It wasn't textbook, but he made the right calls under pressure." Richard's jaw twitched. He looked like a man who had just lost a bet. Marcus kept his expression neutral. He wasn't here to impress Richard Coleman. He was here to prove a point. "Fine," Richard finally said. "You passed." Marcus didn't react, didn't let satisfaction show. He just nodded once. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Marcus could hear. "You think this means you belong here?" he murmured. "We'll see how long that lasts." Marcus met his gaze, unshaken. "I've already lasted longer than you wanted me to." Richard didn't answer. He just turned and walked away. Marcus exhaled, letting the tension roll off his shoulders. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now he had earned his place. Marcus walked out of the Skyward Aviation Training Facility, his footsteps steady, his heartbeat still coming down from the adrenaline rush of the simulation. The air outside was thick with humidity, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of the simulator room. He had passed. He had passed. But the victory felt hollow. Not because the test had been unfair. He had expected that. Not because Richard Coleman had made it his personal mission to see him fail. He had expected that too. But because the moment he proved himself, the moment he showed them he could handle anything they threw his way, it still wasn't enough. He had seen it in Richard's face, in the way Captain Wilkes hesitated before admitting Marcus had done well, in the way Richard's approval came wrapped in bitterness, like he was forced to acknowledge something he hated. This wasn't about skill. It never had been. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting his mom again. Instead, it was a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then answered. "Marcus Reynolds." "You really shook things up in there, kid." Marcus frowned. "Who is this?" "Amelia Carter, senior pilot at Skyward." Marcus blinked, recognition hitting him. He had heard of Amelia before, one of the few female captains at the airline, and someone with a reputation for not playing politics. "How'd you get my number?" he asked. She chuckled. "I have my ways. Look, I wanted to congratulate you. That test was rigged, and you still pulled it off. That takes skill." Marcus exhaled, leaning against his car. "I appreciate that, but I get the feeling you didn't call just to say nice things." "You'd be right," she said. "I'm calling because you need to watch your back. Richard's not done with you." Marcus had figured as much. "Yeah, I got that impression." "You don't understand," Amelia said, her voice sharper now. "Richard doesn't lose. He plays the long game. You embarrassed him today. He's going to find a way to make sure you never make it to the captain's seat." Marcus ran a hand over his face. He had just finished proving himself, and already there was another fight waiting. "So what do you suggest?" "Stay sharp, make allies, and most importantly," she paused, "don't give them any reason to doubt you, because the second you slip, they'll use it to bury you." Marcus let her words settle. He had worked too hard to get here. He wasn't about to let Richard or anyone else push him out. "Noted," he said. "Good," Amelia said. "And one more thing, Reynolds. If you ever need someone who actually gives a damn about skill over politics, you know where to find me." The line went dead. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket, his grip tightening. He had passed the test, but the real fight was just beginning. Marcus adjusted the collar of his crisp, newly issued Skyward Aviation uniform. The fabric was stiff, the embroidered gold wings on his chest heavier than they should have been. He had dreamt about this moment, walking through an airport terminal, dressed as a pilot, knowing he had earned his place in the cockpit. Yet as he strode through the crew lounge at Atlanta International, he could feel the stares. Some were subtle, others weren't. A few pilots nodded in acknowledgement, but many looked past him like he wasn't there. Some glanced at the name on his uniform. Reynolds, their expressions shifting, realizing who he was. Not because of him, because of his father. His father's legacy followed him into every room, whether he wanted it or not. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. Reynolds? Marcus turned to see a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes approaching. His uniform bore 4 gold stripes, a captain. Yes, sir, Marcus answered, standing a little taller. The captain extended a hand. Captain Whitmore, I'll be your captain for today's flight. Marcus shook his hand. Whitmore's grip was firm, professional. First officer today, Whitmore continued. You ready? Marcus nodded. Absolutely, sir. Whitmore studied him for a second, then gave a small nod. Good, let's get to work. They walked toward the gate, where the rest of the crew was waiting for their briefing. The flight attendants gave him a polite but cautious glance, their professionalism masking any assumptions they might have had. It wasn't until they reached the jet bridge that Marcus caught sight of someone he wasn't expecting. Richard Coleman. He stood near the boarding area, talking to another executive. The moment his eyes landed on Marcus, the smirk returned. Marcus met his gaze, refusing to react. If Richard was here, it wasn't just coincidence. Whitmore didn't seem to notice. He led Marcus into the cockpit, settling into the left seat as Marcus took the right. All right, Whitmore said, flipping switches, checking systems. Let's see what you got. Marcus focused, blocking everything else out. This was what mattered. The plane, the instruments, the flight plan. He went through the pre-flight checks, his hands steady, his voice controlled. Atlanta Tower. This is Skyward 318, requesting clearance for takeoff. The response came through the headset, and moments later they were taxiing to the runway. This was it. As the plane accelerated down the runway, Marcus felt the familiar rush. The moment the wheels lifted off, all the noise, Richard, the stairs, the politics, faded. At 35,000 feet, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The hum of the engines filled the cockpit as Flight 318 cruised through the sky, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon. Below them, the vast landscape of the Midwest stretched endlessly, a patchwork of green and gold fields. Marcus kept his hands on the controls, focused on every detail. This was his first official flight as a first officer for Skyward Aviation, the moment he had worked for his entire life. But even up here, where the sky was limitless, he could feel the weight of the ground below. Captain Whitmore adjusted the radio, his tone casual but professional. So, Reynolds, he said, eyes still on the instruments, I heard your interview was eventful. Marcus kept his expression neutral. That's one way to put it. Whitmore smirked slightly. Richard Coleman doesn't usually take such a personal interest in new hires. You must have made quite the impression. Marcus didn't take the bait. He wasn't about to turn this flight into a discussion about office politics. I just did what any other candidate would do, Marcus said simply. Whitmore let out a dry chuckle. Right, and that's why half the pilot lounge is talking about you. Marcus didn't react. He had felt the tension the moment he stepped into the crew area. Some people respected him, others resented him, and then there were those who were just waiting for him to fail. You handle yourself well, Whitmore continued, his tone more measured now. But let me give you some advice. There are people in this company who don't like change, and whether you mean to or not, you represent change. Marcus met his gaze. And what about you, Captain? Where do you stand? Whitmore considered the question for a moment before answering. I stand where the talent is. If you're good, you belong. Simple as that. Marcus appreciated the honesty. The radio crackled, cutting through the conversation. Skyward 318, be advised. Moderate turbulence reported ahead. Marcus acknowledged the transmission, tightening his grip on the controls. Moments later, the first jolt hit. Not strong, but noticeable. Turbulence, Whitmore muttered, adjusting a few settings. Nothing to worry about, but let's keep an eye on it. Marcus nodded, scanning the displays. He had dealt with turbulence before. This was nothing, until it wasn't. The next jolt was harder, the plane shuddering as it dipped slightly. Whitmore sat up straighter. That wasn't moderate. Marcus quickly checked the radar. The storm front wasn't supposed to be this aggressive. He tightened his grip, his instincts kicking in. Another jolt, stronger this time. The seatbelt sign blinked on automatically as the plane rocked. Passengers are gonna feel that, Whitmore muttered. Marcus adjusted their altitude, trying to smooth out the ride. I can take us up a few thousand feet, see if we can get above it. Whitmore considered it, then nodded. Do it. Marcus adjusted the controls, bringing them up slowly. For a moment, it worked. The ride smoothed. Then, without warning, a sudden, sharp drop. The cockpit alarms blared. Whitmore cursed under his breath. That's not turbulence. That's a wind shear. Marcus's heart pounded, but he didn't let it show. This was exactly the kind of moment pilots train for. Countering, he said quickly, adjusting their pitch, stabilizing. The plane shuddered, but the descent slowed. Seconds stretched long. Then finally, the turbulence eased. The alarms silenced. Marcus exhaled, scanning the instruments. We're stable. Whitmore glanced at him, then gave a slow nod. Not bad, Reynolds. Marcus just nodded back. The radio crackled again. Skyward 318. Looks like you hit a stronger pocket than expected. Everything good up there? Whitmore keyed the mic. We're all good. No damage. Just a bumpy ride. He turned back to Marcus, studying him for a moment. You're calm under pressure. That's good. Marcus shrugged. It's part of the job, right? Whitmore smirked. Sure, but some people crack when they realize they're responsible for 200 lives at once. You didn't. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to, because this was where he belonged. Marcus stepped off Flight 318, feeling the weight of his first official flight settle in. Not just the physical exhaustion, but the quiet realization that this was only the beginning. The flight had been smooth aside from the turbulence, but it wasn't the air that was unstable. It was everything on the ground. The moment he walked into the Skyward Aviation Crew Lounge, the shift in energy was unmistakable. Conversations dipped, eyes flicked toward him, and a few pilots exchanged glances before turning away. Whitmore, walking beside him, let out a low chuckle. Welcome to the club, he muttered. Marcus shot him a glance. Which club is that? The one where half the people in this room are waiting to see you screw up. Marcus smirked. Sounds exclusive. Oh, it is, Whitmore said dryly. And the best part? You don't even have to pay membership fees. Marcus exhaled, letting his gaze sweep over the room. He had seen it before, in flight school and training. The silent doubt, the quiet exclusions. But he wasn't here to make friends. As he moved toward the lockers, a familiar voice stopped him. Reynolds. He turned to see Richard Coleman standing near the entrance, arms crossed, that same smug expression on his face. Captain Whitmore, Richard said smoothly, nodding toward him. I assume the flight went well? Whitmore shrugged. Landed in one piece. That's all you can ask for, right? Richard's smirk barely wavered. And how was our newest first officer? Whitmore shot Marcus a look before answering. Handled himself just fine. Marcus met Richard's gaze, waiting for whatever was coming next. Richard nodded slowly. Good. I'll be keeping an eye on your progress, Reynolds. We have high standards here at Skyward. Marcus didn't blink. I'm aware. Richard held the silence for a moment longer, then gave a small, insincere smile. Then I look forward to seeing if you can meet them. With that, he turned and walked away. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. The test wasn't over. It never had been. Whitmore clapped a hand on his shoulder. You're in his head, he murmured, and that's not a bad place to be. Marcus exhaled. Maybe, but it was also dangerous, because if Richard was watching, he wasn't just waiting for Marcus to fail, he was planning it. Marcus sat at the corner of the Skyward Aviation Crew Lounge, his coffee cooling in his hands. The low hum of conversation filled the space, but none of it included him. Pilots and flight attendants moved around him, talking, laughing, business as usual. He wasn't naive. He knew what was happening. They were watching. Not in the obvious way, but in the way people did when they were waiting for something to happen. Waiting for him to prove them wrong, or prove them right. His first flight had gone smoothly, too smoothly, and that meant the next challenge wasn't going to come from the air. It was going to come from the ground. A shadow crossed his vision. Marcus glanced up to see Amelia Carter standing over him, a knowing smirk on her face. You planning on drinking that coffee or just watching it get cold? Marcus smirked back. Haven't decided yet. She pulled out a chair sitting across from him. You made quite the entrance, Reynolds. Your name's been coming up a lot. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Good things or bad things? Amelia tilted her head. Depends on who you ask. He exhaled, leaning back. Let me guess. Half the people here think I don't belong, and the other half are waiting for me to screw up. She shrugged. Sounds about right. Marcus swirled his coffee absently. You ever get tired of this game? Amelia smirked. Every day. But the thing about this industry, it's not about who's best. It's about who's still standing when the dust settles. Before Marcus could respond, a familiar voice cut through the room. Reynolds. He turned to see Captain Wilkes approaching, his expression unreadable. You're flying with me today. Report to Gate 47 in 20 minutes. Marcus sat up straighter. Didn't see my name on the schedule. Wilkes crossed his arms. It just got added. Problem? Marcus glanced at Amelia, who didn't say anything, but her expression told him all he needed to know. This wasn't just another flight. Marcus met Wilkes's gaze. No problem at all, Captain. Wilkes nodded once, then walked away. Amelia exhaled. They're testing you. Marcus smirked. They've been testing me since I walked in the door. Yeah, but this one's different, she said, her voice low. Wilkes isn't just some random captain. He's close with Coleman. If they put you on this flight last minute, there's a reason. Marcus finished his coffee in one sip, setting the cup down. Then I guess I better show them why that was a mistake. Amelia grinned. That's the spirit. Marcus stood, adjusting his uniform. He could feel it again. That pressure, that silent challenge hanging in the air. But if Richard Coleman thought he could stack the deck against him, he had another thing coming, because Marcus had no intention of losing. The moment Marcus stepped onto the jet bridge leading to Flight 226, he knew something was off. The air felt heavier, like a storm was brewing beneath the surface. Pilots trusted their instincts, and right now his were screaming. Captain Wilkes was already in the cockpit when Marcus arrived. The older man barely looked up as he flipped through a pre-flight checklist. Reynolds, he said flatly, you ready? Marcus slid into the first officer's seat, his movements controlled. Always. Wilkes glanced at him, expression unreadable. Good, because today's going to be interesting. Marcus raised an eyebrow. How so? Wilkes smirked, tapping the flight log. Weather's looking tricky. High crosswinds on approach. We'll see what you can do. Marcus met his gaze. So that's how they wanted to play it. He nodded. Sounds like a good challenge. Wilkes didn't respond. Instead, he keyed the radio. Tower, this is Skyward 226, requesting clearance for pushback. The flight progressed normally for the first 2 hours. Marcus handled the controls with precision, responding to every instruction with practiced ease. Wilkes didn't say much. He was watching, evaluating. And then, as they neared their destination, the real test arrived. Tower reports crosswinds at 35 knots, Wilkes said, eyes on the instruments. Borderline limits. Marcus tightened his grip on the yoke. Crosswinds that strong made landing a fight between skill and physics. He had trained for this, but he knew what was happening. They wanted him to mess up. You want to take this? Wilkes asked casually, even though it wasn't a question. Marcus nodded. I got it. The airport came into view, the runway stretching below them. The wind howled against the fuselage, buffeting the aircraft left and right. Marcus adjusted their descent, countering the gusts, keeping the plane aligned. His focus narrowed, blocking out everything except the landing. Wilkes was silent, waiting. The runway rushed up toward them. The wind shoved hard, trying to push them off course. Marcus fought back. He angled the nose slightly into the wind, feet steady on the rudder pedals. At just the right moment, he straightened the aircraft and... touchdown! The wheels met the runway smoothly, the plane rolling to a controlled stop. The turbulence faded, replaced by the familiar hum of a successful landing. Wilkes exhaled. Not bad, Reynolds. Marcus smirked. I try. Wilkes didn't respond, but Marcus caught it. The flicker of something in the captain's eyes. Respect, not from everyone, not yet, but it was a start. Marcus stepped out of the cockpit, adjusting his sleeves as passengers disembarked. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the tarmac. The adrenaline from the landing still lingered in his veins, but he kept his expression unreadable. He had handled the crosswinds, handled them well, but he knew better than to celebrate too soon. Wilkes stowed his flight log, giving Marcus a measured look. "You ever handle winds like that before?" Marcus shrugged. "Once or twice." Wilkes let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, sure. Listen, Reynolds, that landing was solid, but one good flight doesn't make a career." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "Good thing I plan on having more than one." Wilkes studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We'll see." The older man walked off, leaving Marcus standing alone near the jet bridge. He could still feel the eyes on him, watching, judging. He was used to it. As he made his way through the terminal, his phone buzzed. A message from Amelia. "Heard about the landing. Coleman's not happy. Be ready." Marcus exhaled. Of course Richard wasn't happy. It didn't matter that he had handled the landing. What mattered was that he hadn't failed, and that meant Coleman would come at him from another angle. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket, his mind already working. The flight was over, but the real battle was still ahead. He had proved himself today, now he just had to do it again, and again, and again. Marcus sat in the dimly lit crew lounge, his coffee untouched. The last flight had been textbook. Too clean, too perfect. That's what bothered him. He knew how this game worked. When people like Richard Coleman wanted you gone, they didn't just wait for you to fail, they made sure you did. His phone buzzed, another message from Amelia. "You on today's schedule?" Marcus frowned. He wasn't supposed to be. He had checked last night. He had a day off. He pulled up the updated roster. His name was suddenly listed for a high-stakes international flight, Skyward 819, a long-haul red-eye from JFK to London. He clenched his jaw. The kind of route usually reserved for captains and senior officers, not first officers on probation. They were setting him up. A presence loomed beside him. He looked up to see Captain Wilkes standing there, arms crossed. "Looks like we're flying together again," Wilkes said, voice casual but eyes sharp. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Funny how that happened," Wilkes smirked. "Funny indeed." Marcus studied him. "Let me guess. Coleman's idea?" Wilkes didn't confirm or deny. Instead, he nodded toward the schedule. "You good for this?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "Wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Wilkes watched him for a beat, then nodded. "All right. See you at the gate in an hour." As Wilkes walked away, Marcus tapped a reply to Amelia. "They're trying something. I'll be ready." His fingers hovered over the screen for a second longer before he typed a second message. "Keep an eye on Coleman." He knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a flight. It was a test, and he wasn't about to fail. Marcus arrived at Gate 57, his expression unreadable as he approached the cockpit. The terminal buzzed with late-night travelers, their voices a distant hum beneath the steady announcements of departing flights. Wilkes was already inside, flipping through the flight plan. He barely glanced up. "You ready?" Marcus nodded. "Always." Wilkes didn't say anything else. Just like before. Something about this felt off. Not just the sudden reassignment or the unusual route. It was the way Wilkes carried himself. Like he already knew how the night would end. Marcus slid into the first officer's seat, scanning the flight details. Heavy crosswinds expected over the Atlantic, unstable jet streams, a high-altitude pressure system shifting unpredictably. This wasn't just a difficult flight. It was engineered to be one. The aircraft pushed back from the gate. Marcus listened to the ATC clearance, going through the pre-flight checklist with precise efficiency. He had no intention of giving anyone, especially Richard Coleman, a reason to say he wasn't fit for this. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Marcus noticed Wilkes watching him out of the corner of his eye. "You ever flown this route before?" Wilkes asked casually. Marcus didn't look up from the instruments. "Not commercially, but I've logged transatlantic flights in training." Wilkes hummed. Big difference between training and the real thing. Marcus didn't take the bait. That's why we have procedures. Wilkes chuckled, shaking his head. Sure, procedures. For the next few hours, the flight remained smooth. The passengers slept, the cabin lights dimmed, and the Atlantic stretched endlessly below them. And then, the first problem hit. The cockpit warning panel lit up. Hydraulic pressure loss. System B. Marcus straightened immediately. He checked the instruments, his brain already running through the failure protocols. That's not supposed to happen, he muttered. Wilkes didn't look surprised. Guess we better figure it out. Marcus went to work. The hydraulics weren't completely gone, but something wasn't right. This wasn't normal wear. This was deliberate. His stomach clenched. Coleman had set this up. The aircraft jolted slightly as the autopilot adjusted for the instability. Want me to take over? Wilkes asked, voice unreadable. Marcus shook his head. I got it. He followed the procedures perfectly, rerouting hydraulic power and stabilizing the aircraft. Problem solved. But he wasn't relieved. This wasn't over. A minute later, another warning. Fuel imbalance detected. Marcus's pulse quickened. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had tampered with this aircraft before they ever left the ground. Wilkes adjusted a few controls, acting calm. Want to divert? Marcus clenched his jaw. That was the trap. If he suggested a diversion, they'd say he panicked. If he didn't, they'd say he ignored a critical issue. He took a breath, forcing his voice to stay level. Fuel levels are still stable. We'll monitor and continue. Wilkes studied him. Interesting call. Marcus didn't respond. He knew what this was. A flight that was never meant to land the way it should. The real test had begun. The cockpit was silent except for the steady hum of the engines and the quiet, rhythmic beeping of the warning panel. Marcus stared at the instruments, his pulse steady, but his mind sharp. He had been through enough flight drills to know when a failure was real and when it was manufactured. This wasn't random. Wilkes reached for a switch, his movements deliberate. Fuel imbalance is getting worse. Marcus didn't look at him. I see it. They had two options. Divert or manage. Either choice would be scrutinized. Marcus made his decision. We rebalance manually. We don't have a leak, just uneven distribution. It's controllable. Wilkes raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. All right, Reynolds, your call. There it was, the test, the setup. If he had suggested turning back, they would have called him weak. If he ignored it, they'd say he was reckless. Instead, he did what a real pilot would do. He adapted. Carefully, Marcus rerouted the fuel flow, adjusting the distribution. Slowly, the imbalance warnings faded. Problem solved, again. Wilkes sat back, nodding slightly. Well, I'll be damned. Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. They were expecting him to fail. He didn't. The rest of the flight continued in tense silence. Wilkes watched him, waiting for a mistake that never came. By the time they reached London airspace, the flight had stabilized. Marcus handled the descent smoothly, the aircraft touching down with perfect precision. As they taxied to the gate, Wilkes finally spoke. You did good up there, Reynolds. Marcus kept his response measured. That's the job, isn't it? Wilkes chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, but the thing about this job, some people get every advantage. Some have to prove themselves twice as hard. Marcus met his gaze. I don't mind proving myself. Wilkes studied him for a long moment, then nodded. The cockpit door opened, and Richard Coleman was standing there, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Marcus didn't flinch. He had passed every trap they set for him. Now he was ready for whatever came next. Marcus stepped off the plane into the crisp London air, the exhaustion of the long-haul flight sitting deep in his bones. But more than that, it was the weight of what had just happened, the silent battle he had fought in the cockpit, the traps he had dodged, and the fact that Richard Coleman was still waiting for him. Richard leaned against the jet bridge, his arms crossed, that same smirk playing on his lips. Like a man who had lost a round, but not the war. Marcus didn't slow his stride. If Coleman was here, it meant something was coming. Reynolds, Richard said smoothly as Marcus passed him. I have to say, that was impressive. Thought you might crack under pressure. Marcus stopped, keeping his face unreadable. You were watching? Richard chuckled. Oh, I always watch. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. But don't get comfortable. You may have passed this little test, but that just means the next one will be harder. Marcus exhaled slowly, refusing to rise to the bait. Is that what this is to you? A game? Richard tilted his head. Everything is a game, and the ones who don't know they're playing? He smirked. They lose. Marcus held his gaze. Then I guess you should start worrying, because I do know. Richard's smirk faltered for just a second. A small crack, a sign that he wasn't expecting resistance. Then he recovered, nodding slightly. We'll see, Reynolds. We'll see. Marcus walked away without another word, stepping into the terminal. He could feel the tension in his shoulders, the silent pressure of knowing that the fight wasn't over. But he had survived the worst they had thrown at him. He had proved that he wasn't just here because of his name. He was here because he belonged. His phone buzzed. A message from Amelia. Heard you made it to London in one piece. Welcome to the real fight. Marcus exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't here just to survive. He was here to change things. And he wasn't going anywhere. Marcus Reynolds didn't just land a plane. He landed a message. In a world where the odds are stacked, where names and faces often mean more than skill, he proved that resilience can break barriers. But the fight doesn't end when you win a battle. It continues with every flight, every challenge, every test they throw your way. So what do you think? Can real change happen from the inside, or is the system too strong to break? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if you want more stories of power, justice, and the fight for what's right, make sure to subscribe, because the next chapter is always just around the corner.